In the seemingly peaceful town of Willowbrook, a sinister story of manipulation, deceit, and murder lurked beneath the surface. This tragic tale revolves around three key figures: Margaret Holloway, a mother with a dark agenda; her son, Daniel Holloway, caught in a moral dilemma; and his unsuspecting wife, Emily Holloway, whose life would tragically end as a result of a twisted plot. Daniel Holloway appeared to be the perfect husband. He was devoted to Emily, starting each day with thoughtful gestures like a warm smile and a fresh cup of coffee. Emily, with her golden hair and radiant personality, was everything Daniel had ever wanted. They lived in a charming house on Maple Street, where their love seemed to fill every corner. Their story seemed like a fairy tale, with a bond that had begun when they reached for the same book in a college library. Their wedding was a grand affair, a celebration that involved the entire town. Daniel's love for Emily was evident as he watched her walk down the aisle in her white lace dress. After their honeymoon, they settled into their life together, with Emily creating a warm, loving home and Daniel working at a local bank to secure their future. To outsiders, their life seemed perfect, but perfection often hides cracks. Those cracks began to show with the looming presence of Margaret Holloway, Daniel's mother. Margaret was a woman of influence and a firm grip on her son's life. She had raised Daniel alone after his father's untimely death, and her love was both nurturing and suffocating. Margaret saw Emily as a threat to her control over Daniel and viewed her with deep suspicion. Margaret's disapproval of Emily was immediate and profound. Despite Emily's attempts to win her over with kindness, Margaret's polite facade hid a cold, calculating resentment. Caught between his mother and his wife, Daniel began to feel the strain, and the once unshakable trust between him and Emily began to erode. Margaret's manipulation was subtle at first, planting seeds of doubt in Daniel's mind. She would suggest that Emily was too familiar with other men, making innocent actions seem sinister. Margaret's campaign of deceit grew bolder over time, fabricating evidence of Emily's supposed infidelity, including doctored photographs and staged scenarios. As Daniel's suspicions grew, their loving relationship deteriorated into one of mistrust and anger. The rift between Daniel and Emily widened under Margaret's influence. She fed Daniel's doubts, reinforcing his belief in Emily's betrayal. Eventually, Margaret convinced Daniel that the only way to protect himself and their family was to get rid of Emily. She manipulated him into tampering with the brakes on Emily's car, ensuring her death in what appeared to be a tragic accident. The town of Willowbrook mourned Emily, believing her death to be a terrible accident. Daniel, consumed by guilt, became increasingly isolated, relying on his mother for support. Margaret's plan had worked. She had reclaimed her son, but the cost was the destruction of the love that had once brightened their lives. As Daniel's mental state deteriorated, Margaret intensified her control over him, pushing him to take over his father's business as a way to distract him from his guilt. She isolated him from anyone who might uncover the truth, ensuring his complete dependence on her. However, Daniel's guilt continued to consume him, leading to vivid nightmares and hallucinations of Emily's voice accusing him of his crime. Desperate to maintain control, Margaret resorted to sedating Daniel and even destroyed the forged evidence of Emily's infidelity, hoping to alleviate his torment. But Daniel's mental state continued to decline. In a final act of desperation, Daniel left a note for his mother and drove to the cliff where Emily had died. Overwhelmed by guilt, he took his own life. The town of Willowbrook was shaken by yet another tragedy. Margaret, now alone, faced the consequences of her actions. Her manipulation and control had led to the destruction of everything she had tried to protect. The web of lies she had spun had ensnared her as well, leaving her with nothing but the haunting memories of the lives she had ruined. In the end, Margaret realized that she was the true architect of her own downfall. In the wake of Daniel's death, Willowbrook's once serene and idyllic atmosphere became clouded with a lingering sense of unease. The tragic losses of both Emily and Daniel cast a long shadow over the community, leaving its residents to grapple with unanswered questions and the unsettling feeling that something wasn't quite right. Margaret Holloway, now isolated in her sprawling yet empty home, found herself consumed by the very darkness she had once orchestrated. The house, which had once been a place of control and power for her, now felt like a prison filled with echoes of her past actions. Every corner reminded her of the family she had lost, not to tragedy, but to her own machinations. Despite the community's efforts to move on, rumors began to circulate. People whispered about the Holloway family, speculating on the true nature of the events that had led to such devastating outcomes. Some questioned the accident that had claimed Emily's life, while others wondered about the eerie transformation in Daniel before his untimely death. The perfect facade of the Holloway family was beginning to crack, revealing the darker truths that lay beneath. Margaret, ever the master of appearances, attempted to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She continued to attend community events and charity functions, her demeanor as polished as ever. But beneath the surface, she was unraveling. The isolation, combined with the growing weight of her guilt, began to take its toll. She found herself plagued by nightmares, visions of Emily and Daniel accusing her, their faces twisted in sorrow and betrayal. The once sharp and calculating woman began to lose her grip on reality. Margaret's paranoia grew, and she started to believe that others in the town were piecing together the truth. She distanced herself further from the community, retreating into the shadows of her once proud home. The walls seemed to close in on her, the house itself becoming a silent witness to her downfall. In an attempt to regain some sense of control, Margaret turned to the few remaining people she trusted, business associates and old family friends. She sought to solidify her position, to ensure that her carefully constructed life wouldn't collapse completely. But even these relationships were strained, tainted by the aura of suspicion that now surrounded her. The more she tried to cling to power, the more it slipped through her fingers. One particularly stormy night, as the wind howled outside and the rain battered against the windows, Margaret found herself alone in the study where Daniel had spent his final days. The room, once a symbol of family legacy and pride, now felt oppressive, filled with the ghosts of her past. She sat in Daniel's old chair, staring at the remnants of her shattered life, the silence around her deafening. It was then that the realization truly set in. Margaret had destroyed the very things she had claimed to love. Her manipulation, her need for control, had led not only to the deaths of Emily and Daniel, but also to her own self-destruction. The legacy she had tried so desperately to protect was gone, replaced by a legacy of pain and loss. As the storm raged outside, Margaret finally broke. She cried out into the empty house, her voice filled with a mixture of anger, regret, and despair. The carefully constructed walls of her mind came tumbling down, leaving her vulnerable and broken. For the first time in years, Margaret Holloway was forced to confront the full extent of the damage she had wrought, not just on her son and daughter-in-law, but on herself. In the weeks that followed, Margaret withdrew from public life entirely. The Grand Holloway estate, once a bustling hub of social activity, became a desolate monument to a family destroyed by greed and control. Neighbors whispered about the old woman who lived alone in the big house, a woman haunted by her past. Margaret's health began to deteriorate rapidly. The stress, guilt, and loneliness ate away at her, leaving her a shadow of her former self. She no longer had the strength to maintain the facade of the powerful matriarch. She had become a tragic figure, consumed by the consequences of her own actions. In her final days, Margaret was bedridden, confined to the very house where she had orchestrated so much pain. Her once sharp mind was clouded with memories and regrets, the faces of Emily and Daniel haunting her every waking moment. The house, once her fortress, now felt like a tomb. When Margaret Holloway passed away, there was no grand funeral, no gathering of the town to mourn her loss. She died alone, just as she had lived in her final years, isolated, haunted by her choices. The legacy of the Holloway family, once so revered, was now a cautionary tale, a reminder of the destructive power of control and manipulation. In the end, Margaret's death brought a sense of closure to the town of Willowbrook. The community, still scarred by the tragedies, began to heal, slowly moving on from the dark chapter that had overshadowed their lives. The Holloway estate was eventually sold, its new owners unaware of the tragic history that lingered within its walls. But for those who remembered, the story of the Holloway family served as a chilling reminder that even in the most idyllic of places, darkness can take root. The tale of Margaret, Daniel, and Emily Holloway would be told for years to come, A story of love turned to obsession, of control turned to destruction, and of a family torn apart by the very bonds that were meant to hold it together.